Hey, this is John. Today I just want to talk about the reasons why I think that people should get self-educated, or why they should educate themselves, generally speaking, aside from just the university. And I say self-educate because I do think that's a much more accessible thing for most people. And I think, like me, a lot of people are getting fed up with the university system. And in fact, as my notes kind of indicate here, I am writing a book about this. I have some pretty uh, strong criticism, as I feel, of the educational system in North America. So I am writing about that because I do think that's important to having a fair and just society that functions well. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this, though, aside from that, is because I do think that it's one of the most important issues of our time. So, just kind of give you some perspective on that. One of the things that separates us from medieval peasants is the fact that we have a right to get educated. And one of the reasons why that's important, or maybe why that was suppressed for a very long time, and how society's kind of evolved in lieu of that, is that it makes it very effective for us to coordinate and criticize the systems that currently exist. And without that, it's basically impossible to do that effectively. Um, so you can kind of imagine, like, for example, suppose that you were voting in a candidate who has some economic policies which had recently happened. Well, if you don't understand economic policies, you could basically just have to take somebody's version of that at face value because you don't have any context for which to actually assess those policies or their impacts. So even though we all kind of agree on the same fundamental issues, a lot of us don't really know how to get to from point A to point B effectively. So a lot of the time, I think we end up working against our own interests by not being educated. So, I'm a bigger advocate, I guess, now for, people to get self-educated. And I think that's a more, powerful thing to do anyways. Because if we all kind of have issues with the universities and the way they run things and the way that they sort of extort our youth, then I hope they don't get mad about me saying that, but then I think one of the effective ways to kind of handle that is basically just take a stance and say we don't really need you, and that's effectively what I think self-education does. So I think in that respect it's kind of powerful, but it's also something that can be at least somewhat more detailed than a university education, depending on exactly how you proceed with it. So that's generally my advice. Now, okay, aside from that, I do think that the problem of not being educated generally bleeds into all issues, which is why it's so important and why I call it one of the most important issues of our time, right? So, for example, you can think of like upholding the law, right, and having educated versus non-educated jurors that can or cannot make good logical decisions, right? You can imagine pretty quickly that not having jurors that understand logic, for example, may not do very well. Or on the opposite end, right? In other words, like the convictions are not going to be necessarily accurate or good. On the other end, though, if we have jurors that are that really understand the processes of the law, then we are probably going to have more robust systems in play, and the outcomes are going to be better in those courts. Just on another, example. So, I think generally this bleeds into a lot of issues, right? So, now, some other issues though with formal education right now are that it's really kind of questionable if an education will land you a job. Now, there's been a lot of criticisms of education. Pretty much none of those hold up, at least in the public sphere. Maybe that's another reason why people should get educated on topics, because when they don't, it seems to me like they just kind of parrot stuff they hear online, and that's not good. So, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit and why I think that's wrong. But suppose that you didn't think that it guaranteed you an opportunity, which is kind of what the youth is currently facing. It still doesn't take all of your opportunities away if you do get educated. Whereas if you don't, in my experience, and I think in most people's experience, although there's some outlier examples, you more or less don't really have any opportunity. And a lot of those opportunities will go to people who do have an education, formally speaking anyways. So there's that, and that's, an argument for, still getting a formal education, right? But aside from that, suppose that we don't believe that there's a certain economic benefit granted to us as individuals, then we'd probably agree that a free education is better. And in that case, I obviously advocate for the reading of books for self-education, especially given that it's, in the modern day, effectively free. Okay, so why should we get educated if there's not necessarily economic benefits? And I know I talked about this earlier, and that I think it's just fundamental to living in a, society that functions well. But let's talk about, the three main reasons that I have here. The first is that it can be extremely effective for skill development and expertise. Now, there's a lot of people that have commented on this. None of those comments, or effectively none of the comments that I've heard, actually stand up. So, for example, a lot of people have commented on, the acquisition of skills, right? So let me say two things about that. Or, basically that employers value skills, and then because education is archaic and it's adopted from the medieval system, apparently, that obviously you can't get a job after you get a university degree. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. Okay, and I'll address the most easy one first, which is that historically that's just silly and inaccurate. Adopting it from a medieval education would suggest that we're all sitting in a dark room listening to Galen worship. Okay, and that's obviously not what happens. So, and by the way, Galen was a physician, not like some deity, by the way. Anyways, so, it is very, very different from that system, and there's just not that much carryover, aside from the fact that we do have lectures, right? But even the aspects of note-taking. So, for example, in a medieval education, I believe you were not allowed to take notes, whereas, and really, how are you going to take notes in the dark anyways? Whereas now you can't. So, just a really silly comparison. Then the second point regarding, businesses valuing skills. Well, first, an education does leave you skills, and most of my education was focused on, basically like working the field, and that's whether you take my neuroscience degree or the CFA exams into account. I mean, so many people commented on this. I commented on this again in the CFA review video. There's so many examples of financial statements in there, for example, in case studies and portfolio management examples, that you work through. So, really the problem with people that don't develop skills is not their education, it's them, is that they don't care to go through those things and learn them. So, anyways, and suppose that you didn't learn skills. Well, I don't think employers really value these things anyways, though that seems to be kind of the pervasive opinion in the market. I really think that a lot of, especially our generation, is probably waking up to the idea that perhaps this is just a faux meritocracy. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, so that's that. Now, second is that education is means to not get fooled, right? So I mentioned earlier, for example, right, that if we want to, elect people with good policies, we need to actually know what good policies are, and just getting told, what good policies are by people and not really understanding the context in which they're applied or the kinds of things that they can be doing to trick and or manipulate the data, right? Means that you're really going to be out of your element when you go to do that, and you're not going to know how. So, for example, a lot of people, uneducated people, I would say, don't realize that taking single examples, for example, of phenomena, that single examples of phenomena are not sufficient to draw general principles from, right? And while that's kind of obvious, from the statistical perspective for sure, it's also just obvious from a rational perspective. So, anyways, there's that. There's other examples too, just in your, day-to-day, right? I mean, the fact that we all get sold these, sham products, for example, is one indication of that. So there's that. And then education is made to create change. So this is, I think this is the most important one. I think a lot of people think that, things like gun ownership, for example, are what allow you to fight back against a tyranny. But what I would like to suggest is that maybe the answer is really, that education is kind of the start of it all. And when you think about, things like, for example, the precursors to the French Revolution or the American Revolution, they were led, at least in some respect, by at least the beginnings of intellectual musings, right? And without the ability to articulate ourselves against some of these bad policies, then the only resort that we have to rely on to instigate change then is violence. And there's at least two problems with that. The first is that it's a lose-lose scenario. And then the second is that you typically have to be in, significantly less reasonable circumstances to invoke it. So the problem with that then is obviously that, with an education, then you can challenge things earlier on because approximately where they're going. You might not know exactly, but typically know approximately. And so you can challenge things when, circumstances are just getting unreasonable, right? Whereas with something like violence, you typically have to wait until, or, you will typically wait until, I don't know, you have a situation like the French Revolution, right? And everyone's just doing very, very bad, so much that they can't put up with it anymore. So you can think of it like that, I suppose. Okay, so I think those are all my thoughts today on that matter. If you liked this video, then please like, share, and subscribe. I will have the investment analysis series up start eventually. I think I might have mentioned this earlier, but I'm basically just waiting to improve my German enough that I can follow a German textbook instead. So I don't expect that to take too much longer, but you never know, because I do have other things to do. So anyways, take care.